If you're earning under $100 an hour playing poker, you cannot afford to make this mistake. I'll show you how I've earned over 7 figures using a strategy so simple that if my opponents knew what I was thinking during hands, they'd swear I was kicked in the head by a horse as a child. So all you have to do, ask 3 questions. And the first question we're gonna start off with here, what's their range? So this flowchart that we're going to build today is going to apply for any situation where we are in a heads up pot in position as the pre-flop raiser. If you guys enjoy this video, get value out of this, maybe we will do another one in a couple weeks and try to tackle out of position, but today just for in position. So the very first question, what's their range? And we always want to think in terms of big picture buckets, and we can keep this very, very simple. Are they uncapped or are they capped? Uncapped simply means they can have all these strong hands on this board that are just never folding if all the money is piled in. And capped means they have taken actions somewhere along the way to indicate they don't have the strongest hands in their range. All right, so let's jump into the first hand here. We're playing 2-5, gonna open it up on the button at $20. Villain's gonna call on the big blind, and flop comes Jack 9 deuce, the best flop in all of poker. Now they're going to check it over to us. So that first question we want to ask here, big picture, what is their range? Are they uncapped or are they capped? Well, so far in this hand, villain has done nothing to indicate that they are capped. Sure, maybe they would 3-bet pocket jacks from the big blind a good percentage of the time, but they can have pocket 9s here. They can have pocket deuces. They can have Jack 9 suited. So they can just have a lot of very, very strong hands on this board that are never folding in a million years. So let's go back to our flowchart here. What's their range? So we've determined they're uncapped here. Then we're going to ask our next question. Will they fast play their strong stuff on this board? So let's go back to the board. And yes, a lot of the times players in this situation, if they have a strong hand, if they have deuces, if they have 9s, if we bet, particularly for a small size, there's a flush draw out there, there's all types of straight draws out there. Generally, if we choose a small size here, our opponent is going to fast play their strong hands on this board. Now we ask the final question to get to our answer. What is our hand? And we're gonna keep this very, very simple. We're not gonna get too granular or bogged down in the details. Do we have value? Do we have showdown value? Or do we have a bluff? Well, in this particular situation with 8 high, we have a bluff. So we see here with a bluff, we want to go small on the flop and turn. And again, switch up our hands. Say we have a hand like pocket 10s here on Jack 9 deuce. Well, let's go back to our chart. Now we would have showdown value, and we see here again, we would go small on the flop when we have showdown value. And once again, when we have pocket 9s here, obviously we've got a value hand here with middle set. So we see here when we have value, we would also go small. Our opponents are going to fast play their strong hands. So if we have a value hand like pocket 9s, we want to go small, because if our opponent has Jack 9 or pocket deuces, if they have a very strong hand, they are going to put in more money for us right now. So they're very strong hands. We can still get in money against that range, and we can cooler them. Let's skip showdown value for a second. We'll go over to bluff. With our bluffs as well, we want to go small, because if our opponents are going to fast play a good percentage of their strong hands, we can get our opponent to be capped instead of uncapped. And then you can see when our opponent is capped, we can start applying a ton of pressure, particularly with our bluffs, to get our opponent to do a lot of folding on later streets. And with showdown value, you may be wondering, well, why don't we just check back? And you see here on turns and rivers, we're almost always checking back with showdown value, but on the flop, we like to bet small with showdown value. Well, let's think about what happens if we bet small, if we have a showdown value hand like pocket 10s here. When our opponent just calls on the flop, they're going to be raising off a lot of the strong hands, and in general, our opponents are going to call too much pre-flop, call too much on the flop, and raise off too many of their strong hands. So when they just call here, when we bet small, they generally have a weak range. And then we can use one of my favorite lines in all of poker, which is c-betting the flop with our showdown value hand. We can check back the turn, and then if our opponent comes out on the river and chooses a size that is generally going to be half pot or less, we can just snap call on the river, because our opponent's just going to have a lot of ace highs, a lot of busted straight draws like king 10, queen 10, 10 8, 10 7, etc. And by c-betting here on the flop small with showdown value, we can funnel our opponents into a line where they generally make pretty big mistakes here, because they float the flop too wide and then they just monkey stab on the river. All right, so back to our evolving flowchart here. We know what to do on the flop if our opponents will fast play their strong stuff, but what if they won't? All right, so I've talked about this situation in a few other videos, so I'm just gonna cover it quickly. But if you wanna get more into the weeds here, you can check out our video, This Secret Turns Poker Players into Crushers, where I explain it in a lot more detail. So we're gonna open on the button here with 10-9 of spades. Opponent's gonna call in the big blind, and flop comes ace-7 deuce. And as we go back to our flowchart here, first question we're gonna ask, what is their range, capped or uncapped? Well, they are uncapped, because they can still have a lot of strong hands on this board. And will they fast play their strong stuff? Well, no. This is one of the rare situations on the flop where they're not going to fast play their strong stuff because a lot of their strong stuff feels invulnerable, right? There's not a flush draw out there. There's only really a gut shot wheel draw out there. So if our opponents have a hand like pocket sevens or pocket deuces or ace seven or something like that, a lot of times on this board, even if we bet small, they're not going to fast play because they're not worried about a bad card coming in for their hand. So if we have a bluff here and we just start betting small, is what's going to happen on this board. Our opponent's not going to raise off their strong stuff and they're not going to call with their weak stuff. A lot of their hands like pocket threes or pocket fours or king 10 or whatever might just fold right now, which is pretty good for us when we have 10 high. But when our opponent calls, we have not narrowed or defined their range. So getting to a turn here, even though we pick up equity, even though we now have a gut shot to the nuts, we just haven't defined their range. So we don't really have any good options barreling across turns. If we go big on the turn, well, generally the bigger the size we choose, the less our opponent's going to fast play. So they may just trap again if they have a hand like pocket sevens or ace seven or something like that if we go large on the turn. And if we go small on the turn, sure, our opponent might just raise off their two pair and their sets at a pretty high frequency, but they're just going to have a ton of hands like ace queen, ace jack, ace 10 that are never folding. And now we get to the river and we just haven't put a ton of money into this pot so far. So to get our opponent to fold a hand like ace jack or ace 10 or ace 9 on this river, we're going to have to put in a huge bet. But the problem is here now on this river, well, our opponent could just have ace queen for two pair, or they could have ace king that they flatted pre-flop because in general, live players are pretty passive. So the problem with just betting our range on the flop, particularly with our bluffs, is we just do not have profitable barreling opportunities across turns and rivers. So you see here back to our flow chart, will they fast play their strong stuff? No, they won't on this board. So once again, we're going to ask what is our hand? And you see here with our value, we're generally just going to go big on the flop. So we need to put in the money ourselves. With our showdown value, we are going to check back. And with our bluffs on the flop, we are going to check back generally as well. So if we have a hand like ace king here, a value hand, we generally just want to be putting in a big bet. You see I go with the overbet here, 60 into 42. If we bet small, our opponent's not going to fast play their strong stuff anyway. And they're also just not going to float on this board with threes or fours or king 10 or something like that. So if they have ace X for top pair, they're just probably not folding on this board no matter what size we choose on the flop. So we may as well just go very, very large here when we have value. And when we have showdown value, remember, we like to talk about that line where we funnel our opponents into a line where they call too wide on the flop, we check back the turn, and then they bluff on the river and we can bluff catch. The problem is if we c-bet small here with pocket queens on this board, our opponents don't really call too wide on this particular flop because they just fold a lot of hands like 8-9 suited or pocket threes or pocket fours or jack 10 or whatever. So they're not going to be bluffing on the river. So c-betting with our showdown value is not profitable either. So with our showdown value, we would also be checking back. And then with our bluffs as well, we also want to be checking back here. And I can already hear the people saying, well,
Mark, isn't it good if we just c-bet here and get them to fold a hand like pocket threes or king high when we have jack high?
Yes, it is, and that is a fine option, but just because a play is positive EV doesn't mean it is the highest EV play, and I think by checking back our bluffs on this flop, we're going to have an even higher EV play because we allow our opponent to tell us much more about the strength of their hand. Let's go back to our chart and I will explain. All right, so we've covered the uncapped side here, at least on the flop. Now let's talk about when our opponent is capped. So we see here, what's their range? What do we do now if our opponent is capped? So let's go back to this jack 10 example here. We check back on the flop. Now the turn is a queen and our opponent comes out and checks. Aha. Now our opponent has taken an action to cap themselves because generally live players are so unbalanced here when we check back the flop. If they have a strong ace, if they have two pair, if they have a set, they will just come out and bet the turn, often for a pretty chunky sizing here. So now by checking, they have somewhat capped their range here. Now, if we want to get real pedantic, could they still have a hand like pocket sevens or deuces here that they are trapping occasionally? Okay, but the majority of the time, their strong hands are just going to come out and bet the turn themselves. So when they check, they have now eliminated quite a few of the strong hands in their range. So in this situation, they are now capped. So next, now that we determined they're capped, well, when they were uncapped, we ask, will they fast play their strong stuff? When they're capped over here, we don't have to ask that question because they're capped. So they just don't have the strong stuff. So the question we ask instead is, do they have inelastic hands? And by inelastic hands, I simply mean hands that just aren't folding right now, even if we put a ton of money in. So on this particular board, a7 deuce queen, I would say yes, they do have some inelastic hands. So we just said they'd mostly come out and bet when they have hands like ace jack or ace 7 or pocket deuces. And I would say their inelastic hands here are going to be some weak ace X that checks on the turn, that's trying to play kind of a pot control line, maybe a hand like ace 3, ace 4, ace 6, or maybe a queen X hand like king queen, queen jack, queen 10, etc. These hands are going to be inelastic. They are not folding on this turn pretty much no matter what. So we go back to our chart here. Do they have inelastic hands? Yes, our opponent is probably going to have some inelastic hands on this turn. So now we're going to ask, what is our hand? Well, in this particular spot, we have a bluff. And we see here when we have a bluff, we generally want to go big on the turn, but small on the river when our opponent has inelastic hands that they are just never folding. So why is that? Let's go back to our hand example here. And we're going to bet a big size with Jack 10. And the reason why we want to go big on this turn with our bluffs, because if our opponent has a hand like ace 3 or king queen, we just talked about, they're never folding. So the best bluff is a bluff where our opponent calls on the turn and then folds on the river. Just because our opponent is inelastic right here, right now on the turn, does not mean they're going to be inelastic on the river. So you see here, our opponent is going to call. We're going to go to the river. The river is a 9. We're going to go back to our flow chart here. What is their range? They were capped on the turn. They are still capped on the river. Nothing has really changed here. Do they have inelastic hands? So let's go back to our hand here. And I would say pretty much no. The only real inelastic hand in our opponent's range is going to be a hand like ace 9, which is going to be a very, very small part of the range. The majority of the range is going to be elastic here. It's going to be a lot of hands, again, like ace 3, ace 4, ace 5. So we see here, do they have inelastic hands? In general, no. So once again, we ask, what is our hand? Well, we have a bluff on this river. We see when they do not have inelastic hands, our bluffs generally want to go small on the turn to keep those hands in, but they want to go big on the river here. So now when we have a bluff on this river, we would want to go big because we want to get hands like ace 3, ace 4, ace 6 to fold. So we would just choose the size that accomplishes that. You see, I'm going to go 2.5x pot here, and we can get our opponent to fold a hand like ace 3. Now let's look at the same situation when we have value. So we checked back pocket queens on the flop, which were showdown value. Now we've hit a set on the turn. So now we've got value. Our opponent is going to check. Let's go back to our chart. What is our opponent's range? They are capped. Do they have inelastic hands? Well, yes, they have a lot of weak ace X. It's just not folding. What is our hand? Value. Value wants to go big here. And we're starting to notice a pattern. Value and bluffs are generally going to want to play the same on turns. We have the same goal. We want our opponent to put in a ton of money on the turn. And then on the river, we're going to split here. And on the river, generally, we see if our opponent has inelastic hands, our value is going to go big and our bluff is going to go small. And then if our opponent does not have inelastic hands on river, in general, our value is going to go small and our bluffs are going to go big. So we see here, value and bluffs have the same goal on turns, but then they start diverging from that goal on the river. Let's see here with pocket queens, we're going to go big on the turn because our opponent's just never folding a weak ace X hand, or if they have the last queen in the deck, they're just never folding that either. So we're gonna go big on the turn. And now on the river, we need to go relatively small. And when I'm talking about big versus small, when we're playing live poker, absolute size of the bet is going to be much more important than the relative size of the pot that bet is. So we see here that this is almost a pot size bet, but it's only $150, which is just not going to be that big of a bet in a 2-5 game. So this is the size I think we would need to bet on this river to ensure a hand like ace 3, ace 4, ace 6 calls us on this river. So we go 150. As you see here, we get called. All right, so let's put it all together, make this start making sense. Let's just walk through a bunch of examples rapid fire here. So we've got 8-7 on the button. We're going to open it up. Our opponent's going to call in the big blind. Flop comes jack 9 deuce. What do you know? Our opponent's going to check it over, so let's start at the top of our chart here. What is their range? Well, they are uncapped. They can still have strong hands on this board. Will they fast play their strong stuff? Well, yes, the board is wet and dynamic. Our opponent's going to fast play their strong stuff. What is our hand here? Well, we have a bluff, so we generally want to go small here on the flop or turn to give our opponent a chance to tell us a little bit more about their hand to cap themselves. So we are going to go small. Our opponent is going to call. Now the turn is a 4 of spades here. Well, now on this turn, we would ask again, what is their range? Are they capped or uncapped? And think about this one for a second. On this turn, our opponent's actually going to be uncapped because in general, live players play their draws relatively passively. So getting to this turn, our opponent could certainly have a ton of flushes in their range. So they are uncapped on this turn. We go back to our chart. What's the range? They're still uncapped. Will they fast play their strong stuff? Well, yes, generally, if we choose a small enough size here, our opponents are going to raise their flushes and put in more money with those hands. And we see here with a bluff, we would want to go small. So with 8-7 of diamonds, we we'd want to go small on this turn because we are giving our opponents another chance to cap themselves. And if our opponents just call, we know with a pretty high certainty our opponent doesn't have hands like pocket nines, pocket deuces, jack nine, because those hands would raise on the flop. And we also know that they just don't have a lot of flushes here on the turn, because when we choose a small size again on the turn, those flushes would raise right now. So that's going to give us a profitable bluffing opportunity across rivers with 8 high, because we are essentially forcing our opponent to get to the river with a pretty wide and weak range. And if we had the nuts here, a hand like ace queen of spades, we would also want to go small here on this turn. And you see here, going back to our chart, our value wants to go small here on this turn as well, because if our opponent has a smaller flush, well, they're going to put in more money for us. We get to cooler those hands anyway, so no reason to go for a big bet. And going back to this board, if our opponent has a weak hand that we have drawing dead, like queen 10 or ace jack or something like that, we would hate for those hands to get scared and fold when the flush comes in. So by betting small, their weak hands will call, and their strong hands that we cooler will put in more money for us. So let's go back to 8-7 of diamonds. We bet small and our opponent just calls. We go to the river and our opponent's going to check it over. Now, as we go back to our chart here, we would ask again, what is their range? And as we get to this river, the innocuous 3 of clubs, we would ask again, what is our opponent's range? Are they capped or are they uncapped? And I would say for the most part, they are capped. And because the river does not change the nuts and our opponents did not raise when we bet small on the turn, getting to this river, our opponent is now capped. So going back to the chart, what's their range? They are capped. Do they have inelastic hands that are just not folding? Well, back to the board here, probably not. Are they going to call off for stacks if they have a hand like king jack or queen jack or even ace jack here on this board when the flush has gotten there? No. So do they have inelastic hands? No. What is our hand? Well, we have a bluff and we are on the river. So we would want to go big here on the river to make sure we get a range fold from our opponent, because they're just not going to have flushes. They're just not going to have 2 pair in sets. So we just go big here on the river to make sure our opponents fold all their single pair hands. So we go 260 with the overbet and our opponent is going to fold. And we see here, if we have a hand like ace queen, that hand wanted to play the same on the turn as our 8-7 of diamonds, the same as our bluffs, because we have the same goal on the turn. But now on the river, ace queen wants to go relatively small. And again, small and big are just concepts. We want to choose the size that accomplishes what we want. And in this particular scenario, 120, I think maybe that's the biggest size that queen jack or king jack are going to call. So that's the size we choose here. We go back to our chart. We see what's our hand value. Value wants to go small on this river to make sure that we get called, because they don't have inelastic hands. They're going to be very, very elastic on this river, which means they're going to be sensitive to sizing. So 120 with ace queen, our opponent calls and we are good. All right, slightly different example just to show the nuance here. We open with 8-7 of diamonds. Flop comes the same. On the flop, when our opponent checks to us, back to our flowchart. What is their range? Well, they are uncapped. Will they fast play their strong stuff? Yes, they will fast play their strong stuff on a wet dynamic board. What's our hand? Well, we have a bluff, so we want to go small here on the flop and or the turn. So we are going to go small. Our opponent is going to call. We go to a turn, which is a 4. And now back to our handy dandy chart. What is their range now? Well, now our opponent is capped. The nuts have not changed on the turn. It hasn't brought in a bunch of strong hands into our opponent's range. So now we're going to ask the next question here. Do they have inelastic hands? Well, let's go back to this board. And I would say yes. They're going to have hands here on this turn, like ace 3 of spades or ace 5 of spades or 6-5 of spades, or even hands like ace jack or king jack for top pair good kicker on a relatively wet board that are just not folding no matter what size we bet here on the turn. And we see here, yes, when our opponent does have inelastic hands, our bluffs are going to want to go big on this turn because our opponents aren't folding their ace high or king high flush draws. They're not folding their open and straight draws. They're not folding their top pair, but that doesn't mean we can't get these hands to fold on the river. Just because they're inelastic now does not mean they're going to be inelastic later. So our bluffs want to go big. And if we did have a hand like pocket nines here, we would also want to go big on the turn. Again, our bluffs and value have the same goal here on this turn. They just want to diverge, and those goals are going to split on the river. So with 8-7 of diamonds, we're going to go big on this turn. Now the river is a 3. And again, we're going to ask, what is our opponent's range? Well, generally, this card does not change much. Our opponents are still going to be capped. And if we want to get really pedantic here, yes, I guess technically our opponent could have 6-5 of spades or ace-5 of spades, but that's 2 combos of hands in a range that's going to be 75 or 80 hands or something like that. So it just really doesn't matter. It's such a small part of their range. We can just kind of ignore it. Back to our chart. Do they have inelastic hands? And this is where things get tricky and are going to be kind of villain dependent. And I would say in general on the river, if you have a lot of stack depth behind, most opponents in 2025 playing live poker do not want to play for stacks with top pair if you are going to be putting in all the money. So against most opponents, I would say no, they don't have inelastic hands because most of the best hands that are going to be in the range getting to this river are going to be top pair, and top pair is not going to play for stacks. stacks. Now, where does this change? If we're 100 big blinds deep, if we're against a fish who just can't fold top pair, etc., etc., there are situations where our opponents are going to be inelastic here. But in general, I'd say most of the player pool is not going to be inelastic on this river with top pair. So let's go back to our hand here. We see we have $840 behind with 322 in the pot. If you're against an opponent and you're like, Mark, I don't think this player is ever folding a hand like King Jack or Queen Jack on this river. If you have pocket nines, you know what to do. You should just be betting 2.5x pot and putting in all the money. If you think they are inelastic, then our value with pocket nines would just want to go big here. And our bluffs, a hand like 8-7 of diamonds, would just want to go small on this river. And back to our hand, why would we want to go small with a hand like 8-7 of diamonds if we think our opponent is never folding a hand like Queen Jack or King Jack? Well, we're just trying to fold hands like ace high flush draws, king high flush draws, queen high straight draws, etc. if we think our opponent's never folding top pair. But if we're against an opponent who we think is going to be more reasonable, who's not going to want to play for all the money, this is going to be the large majority of the player pool, I promise. So we see here, if they do not have inelastic hands, our bluffs on the river want to go big. So we think most players are probably not going to want to hang on with a hand here like Jack 10, Queen Jack, King Jack, etc. So we would just go with the old 2x pot size bet here on this river when we have 8 high to get all those hands to fold. And if we think our opponent is folding King Jack, Queen Jack, Jack 10 for a 2x pot size bet on this river, when we have pocket nines, of course, we don't want to go 2x pot. So we go back to our chart here. What's our hand? Value. Well, value generally wants to go small on this river. And again, remember, small versus big is just a concept to keep it very, very simple. So when we had 8-7 of diamonds here, we want to go 2x pot to make sure Jack X folds. So when we have pocket nines here, we probably want to go slightly less than pot to ensure that hands like King Jack, Queen Jack, Jack 10, Jack 8 suited, that these hands are just never folding. So we go 300 on this river, and villain is going to put in the call. All right, so let's do another example here, and this time I want to talk about a turn we haven't covered when our opponent is uncapped and they won't fast play. So we're going to open Jack 10 here. Our opponent's going to call. Flop comes Queen 8-4. So we are going to ask our first question here, going back to our chart. What is their range? Well, they are uncapped. Will they fast play their strong stuff? Well, the board is monotone, but generally still, if we bet small, our opponent will fast play their smaller flushes, their sets, their 2-pair, etc., because they're scared of a bad turn card coming in. What is our hand? Well, we have Jack high here, so we have a bluff. So we are going to want to go small. On the flop, if our opponent will fast play, we want to c-bet our range small. So we're going to go small with Jack 10. Now the turn brings in a 4 flush and our opponent checks it over. So what is their range here on this turn? Well, they are still uncapped. Our opponent can definitely have the stiff ace of spades in their hand. Now it starts to get a little bit more tricky. Will they fast play their strong stuff? And I would say no, probably not, because the strong stuff here would be the ace of spades. And if they have the ace of spades, they don't really have to worry about a bad card coming in. They have kind of the invulnerable super nuts here. And when our opponent's hands feel completely invulnerable, they don't have to worry about another flushing card coming in. They already have it. They don't have to worry about a straightening card coming in, right? They already have the nuts that beats a straight. The board isn't paired, right? They're just not all that concerned about a bad card coming. And when that is the case, our opponents aren't going to fast play nearly as much. So will they fast play their strong stuff? No, they won't fast play their strong stuff on this board. What's our hand? We have a bluff. And we see here, when we have a bluff in this particular spot, we want to check back in general. Because going back to our hand here, let's walk through our options. What happens if? A fun game I always like to play. Well, if we bet small here, our opponent isn't going to fast play with the stiff ace of spades at a high frequency. So we can't really cap our opponent. We're not going to have a good idea of our opponent's range. If we bet big here, well, our opponent's just going to call with their flushes, including the ace of spades, and we can't really bluff again on the river because, again, we haven't defined our opponent's range. But what happens if we check back here? Well, if we check back on this turn, what happens on the river? If our opponent does have the ace high or king high flush, they often just come out and bet on the river. So by checking back on the turn, we funnel our opponent into an area where we can then get a little bit more clarity on what their range is. And if they check on the river, then they are more capped, which is going to make our bluff more profitable. Our opponent is going to check here on this river. Back to our handy dandy chart. What is our opponent's range? Well, now they are capped here. We would ask, do they have inelastic hands? A lot of times the nuts, the ace of spades, is just going to come out and bet. They get greedy. They're going to be trying to get value from a smaller flush or a set or whatever. So they're just going to come out and bet when they have the ace of spades. But going back to our board here, sometimes if they have the king of spades or the jack of spades or even the 10 of spades, they may check with the intention of check calling no matter what size we bet. Look how big the pot is. It's only $82. Even if we bet 2x pot or 3x pot on this river, our bet is not going to be a big bet for the size of the game. We're not threatening our opponent's stack. So back to our chart here, do they have inelastic hands? Well, yes, they have some hands that may call even if we bet 2x pot on this river or something like that. So yes, they have inelastic hands. What is our hand? A bluff. And we see here our bluff, when they have inelastic hands, wants to go small here on on the river. Our goal here is just to fold out any hands that do not have a spade in them. So back to our hand here, we would probably just want to choose a size like 60 bucks, 50 bucks, something like that. We can fold out the queen X, we can fold out the 8X, we can fold out pocket pairs without a spade that just floated on the flop, etc. And we can be very, very efficient with our bluff size and just get the easy folds here. And if we did get to this river with a hand like king queen with the king of spades, well, that would mean we probably want to go big. So let's go back to our chart. They are capped. Do they have inelastic hands? Yes. What's our hand value? We have the king of spades, we have the second nuts. Value on this river would just want to go big. We see here our value and our bluff want to play very, very differently on rivers. So maybe see here a pattern starting to form. When our opponents are capped, our value and bluffs want to take the same line on turns. You see here when they have inelastic hands, value and bluff both go big on the turn. You see here when they don't have inelastic hands, value and bluff both go small on the turn. So you see here when our opponents are capped, our value and bluffs want to take the same action on the turn because they have the same goal, and then they do something differently on the river. But you see here when our opponents are uncapped, often our value and bluffs have different goals on the turn as well as the river, because our value just wants to pile in as much money as possible against a strong uncapped range, but our bluffs in general are trying to take an action that allows our opponent to cap themselves so we can get to a later street where we know our opponent is capped, where our bluff is going to be more profitable. So when our opponents are uncapped, our bluffs and value play differently on turns, and when our opponent is capped, our bluffs and value play the same on the turn. All right, next example here, our opponent's going to open in the cutoff. We 3-bet on the button with 10-9 of diamonds. Our opponent's going to call king, king, 4 with a couple of spades. Our opponent checks it over, and let's go back to our handy dandy flowchart. What is our opponent's range? Well, they are uncapped. Will they fast play their strong stuff? Well, it's a paired board in a 3-bet pot, but in general, unless the board is ace high, bone dry, our opponents generally are going to fast play their strong stuff too much. So I would say yes, our opponents are going to fast play their strong stuff. What is our hand? Well, we have a bluff, so we want to go small here on the flop. We go small, our opponent is going to call. We go to a turn, which is the ace of spades. Our opponent checks it over back to our chart. What is our opponent's range? Well, they are going to be uncapped. They can now have flushes. Will they fast play the strong stuff? And here is where we get a little bit tricky. So going back to this board, there is a king, king, and an ace out there. We are in a 3-bet pot. We are the pre-flop 3-better. So what hand do opponents always put us on in a 3-bet pot when we're the 3-better? Ace, king. And look, the board is paired. There is an ace, king out there. We have shown nothing but aggression so far. Even if our opponent does have a flush, this is one of the rare situations where they will not fast play. So back to our chart, will they fast play their strong stuff? No, they most likely won't because they're terrified of ace, king in a 3-bet pot. So what is our hand here? We have a bluff, and you see here, because our opponent is uncapped and they will not fast play their strong stuff, we generally want to check here to try to get our opponent to cap themselves. So we are going to check back. The river is a deuce, and now when our opponent checks, we've got the green light. If our opponent had a flush after we check back the turn, oftentimes they would just come out and lead here on this river. We've given them rope. We have shown weakness. We have opened up the door. So when our opponent checks, now we go back to our chart. Now our opponent is capped. Do they have inelastic hands? Well, no. In general, I would expect a lot of their flushes to come out and just bet on the river. So we see here our bluff wants to go big, and we think we can just get almost all of their range to fold here on this river. So with 10-9, we would go 300, and our opponent will fold. Now let's play this same turn when we have ace king. So we 3-bet, our opponent called. We see bet small on the flop, our opponent called, and now we make the nuts here on the turn. So what does our hand want to do? Again, we're going to go back to our chart. Is our opponent capped or uncapped? Well, they are uncapped because they can have quite a few flushes here. Will they fast play their strong stuff? No, because they're terrified of ace king. What is our hand? We have value. Aha! And you see here, value wants to go big. Just because our opponents will not fast play their flushes doesn't mean they're ever folding in a million years here on this turn. And if we go back to the board, what does betting small really accomplish here? If our opponent has a hand like pocket 8s, pocket 9s, pocket 10s, pocket jacks, are those hands calling no matter what size we bet on this turn? Probably not, unless we go egregiously small and they have a hand like pocket jacks with the jack of spades or something like that, maybe? In general, if we breathe on this pot on the turn, our opponent's weak stuff is going to fold, but if they have 10-9 of spades or queen jack of spades or something like that, they're just never folding in a million years, but they're not putting in more money for us even if we bet small. So our value here on this turn wants to go large. So you see here when our opponent is uncapped, our value and bluffs often want to take a different action on the turn versus when our opponent is capped, our value and bluffs kind of want to do the same thing on the turn. So back to our hand, our opponent is going to call, go to a river, which is a deuce. Our opponent checks it over. What is our opponent's range on this river? They are still uncapped. They can still have flushes here. Will they fast play their strong stuff? Well, no, probably not. They wouldn't fast play it on the turn. They're not going to fast play it on the river. What is our hand? We have a value hand. So we are going to go big here, targeting our opponent's flushes. We're just going to put the money in. Our opponent is going to call, and we are good. All right, next hand here, our opponent opens in the cutoff. We 3-bet on the button again with the second best hand in poker, and our opponent calls. 8-6-4, our opponent checks it over. Back to our handy dandy chart. What is their range? Well, they are uncapped. Will they fast play their strong stuff? Well, the board is wet and dynamic, so yes, they most certainly will. What's our hand? Value. See here on the flop, we are just betting small when they were fast play their strong stuff with both our value, our showdown value, and our bluffs. All generally want to go small here on the flop. So with pocket aces, we are going to go small. Our opponent's going to call. Turn is now a deuce, and they check it over to us once again. Now this turn has not changed anything, so what is their range? Well, when they check call on the flop, now they are capped. Do they have inelastic hands? Well, let's go back to our board. Well, yes, in general, they're gonna have ace high flush draws. They're gonna have hands as strong as like pocket queens, pocket jacks, pocket tens here on this board. None of those hands are folding. So back to our chart here. Yes, they have some inelastic hands. What is our hand? We have a value hand here, so we would want to go big. And let's say we had a hand like 10-9 of clubs here. Let's say we had a bluff getting to this turn. Well, let's go back to our chart. Again, they are capped. Do they have inelastic hands? Yes. What is our hand? A bluff. A bluff also wants to go big when we have a hand like 10-9 of clubs here, because the bluffs and the value, again, when our opponent is capped, have the same goal on the turn: get our opponents to put in as much money as possible. The value wants them to call on the river. The bluff wants them to call on the turn and then fold on the river. Remember, the best bluff is the one where they call the turn and then fold the river. So 10-9 of clubs here would have the same goal with pocket aces. We want our opponent to pile in as much money as possible with their inelastic hands before we get them to fold a bunch of that stuff on the river. We're gonna go to the river, which is a 6 pairing the board. Our opponent's going to check it over. Let's go back to our chart. What is the range? Well, they're still going to be capped. They shouldn't have much 6x here in a 3-bet pot after calling a big bet on the turn. Do they have inelastic hands? And going back to our board, this is where things get tricky here, and this is the nuance that I want to try to get across. So in this situation, let's look at two things. Number one, this is a 3-bet pot, so our opponent can have over pairs to this board. They can have hands like 9s, 10s, jacks, queens here all the time. Number two, the pot is already huge, $727, and we only have 640 behind. So I would say in this situation, our opponent does have inelastic hands. I don't think hands like queens, jacks, 10s, whatever, are folding on this river for less than a pot-sized bet when the pot is already so big. Contrast this to an example like this, where we open 8-7 of diamonds, our opponent check calls on the flop, calls a big bet on the turn, and then we get to a river. In this situation, the pot's only $322. We have 2.5x pot behind, and our opponent just can't have over pairs here that they are very, very attached to. I think in this situation, because the pot is smaller, we have so much more money behind, our opponent can't have over pairs. In this situation, our opponent does not have inelastic hands, where in this situation, our opponent does. Two big differences. Number one, the SPR is less than 1. We can't overbet here. We don't have enough stack depth behind. Number two, because it is a 3-bet pot, our opponent can have a lot stronger range. They can have over pairs to the board here. And while I think live players have become quite capable of folding top pair if we put in a 2x or 3x pot size bet on a lot of rivers, I still do not think they're folding over pairs, particularly when we have less than a pot size bet left behind. So in this situation, do they have inelastic hands? Yes. What is our hand? Value. So you see here with value, because our opponent is going to be inelastic with their over pairs, back to our hand here, pocket aces would just want to put all of the money in here to target queens, jacks, 10s, and 9s. And if we do get to this river with a bluff, like 10-9 of clubs, well, let's go back to our chart. Do they have inelastic hands? Yes, same thing. What do we have? A bluff. And we see here on the river, our bluff would just want to go small. So back to our hand here. Why would 10-9 of clubs want to go just small on this river? Well, we don't think our opponent is folding over pairs here, but we have 10 high. So we could have a very profitable bluff if we just go very small, get our opponent to fold their ace high, king high, queen high flush draws. And if they just fold all of those hands, it's going to be a profitable bluff here with 10 high. All right, next hand here, cutoff opens again. We're going to 3-bet on the button with pocket kigglies, and the cutoff is going to call. Flop comes 9-4 deuce. Our opponent checks it over to us, and back to our chart here. What is their range? They are uncapped. Will they fast play strong stuff? And I would say, even though the board is dry here, it is still dynamic. And by dynamic, I mean a lot of turn cards change the nuts. So going back to this board here, a 3, 5, 6, 10, jack, queen, king, ace, all of these turn cards change the nuts. So even though the board is not wet, it is still dynamic. And when the board is dynamic, players will fast play quite a bit more. Versus when the flop is a 7 deuce. We see here pocket aces are going to be the nuts on almost every turn card here. So this board is also dry, but this board is static. I find static versus dynamic is much more important for when our opponents will fast play and when they will not on the flop. So back to our chart here. What's our hand? Value. We are just going to go small here because our opponents will will fast play their strong stuff. So we go small, our opponent's going to call. The turn now is a king and our opponent checks it over to us. So let's go to our chart here. What is their range? Well, on this turn, they are now capped because they check called on the flop. So the next question we have to ask, do they have inelastic hands? Let's go back to the board here, and specifically when we have pocket kings, do they have inelastic hands? Their only real draws here after they've check called on the flop are maybe hands like ace 5 and ace 3 wheel draws that are just gut shots. So those hands aren't inelastic. If they have hands that were over pairs on the flop, like tens, jacks, or queens, those hands aren't inelastic when an overcard, specifically a king, now comes on the turn. If they have 9x, they can't have a flush draw. So in general, no, they don't really have inelastic hands here. So we see here, what is their range? Capped. Do they have inelastic hands? No. Then we ask, what is our hand? And we have value here, so we would want to go small here on this turn. Back to our board. Why would we want to go small? We want to make sure hands like pocket tens, pocket jacks, pocket queens, ace 5, all these hands, we want to stick around. We want to get value from all these hands. And if we bet big, pretty much all of their range is just going to fold. So with pocket kings here, we would want to go small. If we had a hand like ace 3 of diamonds here for a bluff, we would also want to go small because we want them to call with hands like tens, jacks, queens, 9x. We can get that stuff to fold on the river. Remember, when they are capped, our value and our bluffs often want to play the same way on the turn because they can then split on the river. So with ace 3 of diamonds here, we would also go small. Pocket kings, we would go small. Getting to a river, which is a 7, our opponent checks it over. Back to our chart. What is their range? Well, they're still capped. Nothing really changed here on the river. Do they have inelastic hands? No, they didn't have inelastic hands on the turn. They probably don't have inelastic hands on this river. What do we have here? Well, we have value. Back to our hand here. Pocket kings on this river. We just want to go very, very small, trying to get a hero call from a hand like jacks, queens, tens, something like that. And if we did have ace 3 of diamonds, let's go through the chart again. What is our opponent's range? Capped. Do they have inelastic hands? No. What is our hand? Well, now we have a bluff. And we see here on the river, when we have a bluff, we want to go big. The same reason we want to go small when we have pocket kings. We want to make sure they fold hands like tens, jacks, queens, etc. When we have a bluff on this river, we want to make sure we fold all of those hands. So we would just choose the size that we think gets it done. And we see here, once again, small versus big is just a concept in this specific scenario. Maybe 130 is small and 350 is big, but it just depends on what we are trying to accomplish. And on this particular river, we just choose the size that we think folds a hand like pocket queens all of the time when we have a hand like ace 3 of diamonds, and we choose the size that we think pocket queens calls all the time when we have pocket kings. All right, let's walk through one more. We are going to open on the button with ace 5 of spades. Our opponent calls in the big blind. Jack 9 deuce. Look at that sweet baby there. All right, our opponent checks it over to our chart here. What is their range? They're uncapped. Will they fast play their strong stuff? Yes. What is our hand? We have a bluff, so we are going to go small. So we go small. Our opponent is going to call. We go to a turn, which is the innocuous 4 of diamonds. Our opponent checks it over. Back to our chart. Well, now, since they have not check raised the flop on a wet dynamic board, the turn changes nothing. They are now capped. Do they have inelastic hands? Well, yes. Going back to this board, they have hands like ace high flush draws, combo draws, jack X. None of these hands are folding, even for a big size on this turn. So back to our chart here. What's our hand? Bluff. We want to go big here on this turn when we have a hand like ace 5 of spades. You see here, if we had value, we would also want to go large here, and it's not because we want to be balanced. We don't give a shit about being balanced. Our bluffs and value, when they are capped, just often have the same goal. So we are going to overbet. We go big. Our opponent calls. We go to the river now, and now we make the nuts, and we haven't seen this here. So let's go back to our chart. What is our opponent's range? Our opponent is uncapped. Will they fast play their strong stuff? And this is where it's going to be opponent dependent. If we are against an opponent who's going to put in more money for us on the river when they have a flush, then the answer would be yes. And when we have value on this river, we would want to go small. So if we have a hand like ace 5 of spades here, we can just go $100 here on this river. We go small. And if our opponent does have a queen high flush, a king high flush, a 10 high flush, by going small on this river, well, if our opponent's going to put in more money for us with their flushes, we're just going to be able to play for stacks against those hands, which is great. And if our opponent does have a hand that's been downgraded on this river, a hand like jack 10 or jack 8 suited or something like that, well, those hands are just never going to fold for the small size. So by going small on this river, if our opponents are going to be relatively aggressive, we just get to cooler their flushes and play for all the money anyway. And when our opponent just has a weak top pair when the flush comes in, we still get value against those hands. Now let's say our opponent is super passive and they will not fast play their hands. The answer is no. So what's our hand value? So if our opponent would not fast play their hands on this river, we would just want to choose a massive size, maybe like 500, 600, 2x pot, something like that. We would forget about targeting the Jack X, and we would just go huge here to target our opponent's flushes that won't put in more money for us. So we can see here how this is just going to be player dependent. All we have to do is just ask the question, will our opponent fast play on this river? If yes, we want to go small here with our value. If no, we want to go big here with our value. Same thing when we have a bluff getting to this river. So let's say our opponent will fast play their strong stuff. So you see here our value wanted to go small to make sure Jack X calls and to make sure their flush is raised. So when we have a bluff, we would just go medium. So back to our bluff now. And the goal here with Queen 10 is to make sure we lose the minimum when our opponent has a flush. They're just never folding those hands in a million years, right? And to also get our opponent to fold a hand like Jack X when a scare card gets there on the river. So Ace 5 of spades wanted to go 100 to ensure that Jack X always calls and flush is always raised. Or Queen 10 here would just go slightly bigger. We just want to choose the size where we're going to fold the Jack X that is scared of the flush coming in on this river. So we go 250. We can't just go huge because our opponent is still uncapped. And if we just blast on this river, we just lose a ton of money against flushes. So the only goal here when we have Queen high, make sure our opponent folds the Jack X. So our value would want to go small. Our bluff would want to go just slightly bigger, medium. All right, so you see again, here is the flowchart in its full glory here. And we can get to an answer in every single node here by asking maximum 3 questions. So that big mistake I talked about at the beginning of the video, if you're not yet making $100 an hour, there is no reason to overcomplicate things. Balance this, GTO this, equilibrium this. There is no reason for that in live poker. And you don't even need a crazy flowchart like this, right? Just use whatever works best for you. But the overall point here is, in my opinion, to crush live poker, all you have to do, come up with a simple set of questions, a repeatable set of questions that you ask yourself in every hand that allows you to get to the correct answer very quickly. And whether it's a very beautiful flowchart like this one here, or just a list of questions you use, if you can throw out the complex stuff, simplify everything, you will get to $100 an hour and become a crusher much quicker than you think is possible. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and it turns you into the biggest boy possible. Thank you guys and have a gentle day.